So
Hmm.
with that in mind, there's now a report out of Belgium, out of Croatia, and about Franjo Ivanovic,
Hmm.
played for Union Saint-Gilloise, plays for Union Saint-Gilloise, who signed him for 4 million euros last August from Rijeka. Um, he was extremely successful in Belgium last year. Scored 11 goals in 24 Jubilee Pro League regular season games, 6 assists, and then added another 5 goals and 1 assist in 10 Jubilee Pro League Champions League playoff games. Won the Belgium title, right, with Union Saint-Gilloise. His market value has increased significantly from 4 million euros to 30 million euros since he's been at the club. Can play left wing, can play second striker, can play center forward. Is available for around 20 million euros. Born in Austria, although he represents Croatia. On top of that, actually was right on Bayern Munich's doorstep just a few years ago because he went through Augsburg's academy,
Hmm.
and was a very prolific player in the U17 Bundesliga, scoring 15 goals in 17 games there, and then scored 12 goals and 8 assists in 24 U19 Bundesliga games. A complete striker, great profile, 2 national team games already for Croatia, 2 goals. Um, this is the sort of player that who could be Nick Woltemade in 12 months. And Bayern Munich, been criticized for not signing players like that in the past. I am not 100% sure Bayern are really in on him. But he would fit Christoph Freund's profile quite well. Christoph Freund is Austrian. Franjo Ivanovic is born in Austria,
Hmm.
played in Austria as well before he moved to Augsburg. Probably has him had him on his radar for quite some time. And that is the sort of transfer that we mentioned. When we said Bayern Munich have to think outside of the box, bring in players before they become superstars and develop them a little bit themselves. And look, this is a profile of a player who I think is ready for the next step. We're going to talk about he's also linked to other clubs, but Stefan, this makes sense. He would solve a lot of their problems.
Yeah, he would solve a lot of their problems, and I think if I was a Bayern Munich fan, this is the kind of player I'd be wanting to sign every summer. This is the kind of player I'd be expecting Bayern to sign 4 or 5 of these guys every summer. 21 years old, on the cusp of breaking into a top 5 league, doing well in Belgium, Portugal, Sweden, Denmark, wherever, um, and ready to kind of make that step up because he's absolutely strolling it in Belgian football right now. And yeah, he'd be a really smart signing for them. Pick him up for 25, 20, 25 million euros. They've got a backup to Harry Kane. A young player's happy to sit on the bench for much of the season. Obviously, step in when Kane wants to step out. Can also play other positions in that team as well. Um, and he'd be a great signing, Manu. But yeah, you're right. I think we'll have to kind of see what happens because the reporting on it's
Hmm.
not watertight, shall we say. It's obviously
Yeah.
reports from his hometown or his home country rather in Croatia, where, often when there's a kind of young prospect coming through, they'll kind of add a bit of spice, shall we say, to the transfer rumors. So he's obviously linked to Frankfurt, but wouldn't be surprised if, his agent's like, oh, well, we had conversations with Bayern Munich. So you could always say that it's involved in it as well. And that's kind of the way these things work. So
Yeah.
I think he'd be a smart sign for Bayern. But taking a look at this guy, Manu, I think this is the Hugo Ekitike replacement that Frankfurt have lined up.
Yes, I think so too.
You line up him and Hugo Ekitike's player radars, and they're more or less identical. Great non-penalty XG in the box, great non-penalty goals in the box, great offensive duels in terms of taking players on, great expected assists in terms of creating chances for their players.
Mm.
And very, very, very kind of and through all that, also great presence in terms of touches in the box per 90 minutes. As you said, I can kind of complete centre forward who creates goals for teammates, but also score goals like a classic striker. And you can just totally see Frankfurt selling Hikitiki to Liverpool for the best part of 100 million euros, swooping in for this guy for 20, 25 million euros, and then him and Jonathan Burkhart going and score like 50 goals between them next season.
Mm.
And, the world keeps turning. Frankfurt keeps scoring goals.
Yeah.
And this guy, ends up being the next big thing at Frankfurt because, he looks like Manu who's ready to kind of burst onto the scene. And if he moves to Frankfurt, and the interesting thing there as well, Manu, if Frankfurt and Bayern are genuinely interested, it'll be interesting to see which one he picks because, Bayern, obviously the bigger club,
Yeah.
etc., etc. But Frankfurt now have this gravitational pull and they've got this very quickly have established this very proven track record for strikers. And that his
Yeah.
agent or his family or whoever guides him can quite convincingly say to him, look, you can go to Bayern, you'll make a lot more money, you'll sit on the bench, and you'll probably end up at PSV in a couple of years, or you can go to Frankfurt, you'll probably start once they sell Ekitike to Liverpool, and before you know it, in a couple of years, you'll be off to, the Premier League because Tottenham spent 90 million euros on you. So it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see if that plays out, if he does actually pick Frankfurt over Bayern.
I mean, I made this joke on Blue Sky when I saw this rumor and said, congrats Eintracht Frankfurt on selling Ivanovic to insert Premier League club for 130 million euros in 2026. Um, and then I said, in all seriousness, these are the sort of transfers Christoph Freund was hired for. Now watch Markus Krösche get it done. And we spoke about this, right? Like, Christoph Freund is in this really difficult situation that he was brought in to sign the sort of players that Marco Krösche has successfully signed for Eintracht Frankfurt and developed and then sold on. And um, Frankfurt are in this really fascinating position now that they are in a place where Dortmund was a few years ago, right? Where they're getting these young top talents to choose them as the number one destination in Germany and get that final Polish before me being moved on to the very big clubs in European football. And so it's a fascinating thing. I was asked about Hugo Ekitike in the chat, in the Substack chat, and I said, look, Bayern Munich could have signed him. He was offered to them. I think the price at the time was 18 million euros. I wrote somewhere about it, but they went for Matis Tell instead. That was still under Hassan Salihamidzic, so you can't really blame the current regime for it. But it is one of those things where you just know that these players are going to hit, and they are just they either don't let Christoph Freund do what he was signed to do, right, or they have all these other reservations. That we always hear about in the media, and I'm not sure that's because there's too many people talking, too many cooks in the kitchen, that kind of stuff. But
Mm.
I don't think you can do much worse than a player like Franjo Ivanovic. And at the end of the day, you need bodies in attack. We just talked about how Leipzig have several options now in the attack. Frankfurt always have several options. And I remember talking to Timo Hardung, the sporting director at Frankfurt, who works really closely with Markus Krösche. And that interview is on Transfermarkt, right, where he really talked about our goal is always to have a replacement for the replacement kind of lined up, to have 4 or 5 players on our radar that we can sign to bring in. That is progressive thinking and smart thinking, because as a club, they want to get into their goal is to become a regular Champions League club, to eventually play for a Bundesliga title. They're not there yet, but they're building for it, and they have shown patience. And this is a project that started 6-7 years ago, and they have the patience to continue this project as long as it takes and stay on their path. Eventually they will get there. Eventually they will close the gap to the really big clubs, but it takes patience. And unfortunately, the way the transfer window now works, the Frankfurt model is actually a good model for even the biggest teams in German football, right? Where you sign these players before they become big stars. In Bayern Munich's case, you don't have to sell them in the future. You can keep them, but you need to make these transfers to stay competitive with your Premier League competition. Because you now look like some Premier League teams are now signing players like Ivanovic before they even make it to the Bundesliga, right?
Mm.
We always laugh and joke about Chelsea and the crazy transfer policy, and I do think it's too much. But they do sign young players and take a risk at them, and of course they have different financial means, but it's just, I think it's not forward thinking at the moment. In Frankfurt, there's a story now that McAtee is doing a second visit there. um, and could pick them very well over Borussia Dortmund. They get him maybe as well. And this is a story that we're following, and I don't want to dive too deep into it because I don't have all the information on it yet. But Stefan, like, that's, Bayern Munich are not just competing with these Premier League clubs that's signing up talents, but they're getting to the point now where they might be picking out of Bundesliga teams.